What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. Today is a very interesting video because I'm going to be talking to you guys about things that I learned in rehab that helped me pay off debt today. Back in 2013, I had just gotten back from rehab after a very bad run with drugs for a while, and I made a video recently talking about my experience with drugs and debt and addiction and all that. I'll link it up here if you want to watch it. But I struggled with drug addiction on and off for about 8 years. So in 2013, I had gone to an inpatient rehab for 30 days. I came home, I was doing an outpatient rehab for a little while, and I was going to meetings, NA and NA meetings for a while. And in one of those meetings, this girl spoke and she said something very interesting. She had a couple years clean, and she said that she was having trouble surrendering to a situation at work. And surrendering to a higher power is a huge part of NA and AA if you're not familiar. So she was talking about how she was having trouble surrendering to a situation at work. And in that moment, a light bulb clicked for me that the things they're teaching in NA and AA don't just apply to getting sober, they then get expanded to other areas of your life. And so I took that idea with me as I went forward in sobriety, as I was able to learn the tools I needed to stay sober. And then I used those tools in other areas of my life, and one of the major ones that it's been helpful in is debt payoff. So without further ado, let's jump into the tips. Okay, so the first thing I learned in rehab that I use for debt payoff is the old way wasn't working. That's something that's like in the introduction to the NA book, I believe, and it sums it up perfect. The old way of doing things wasn't working. Whatever systems you had in place for trying to stay sober, or whatever systems you had in place to try to get your finances in order and get your debt under control, it just wasn't working. You were trying different things, you were trying it your way, and it just wasn't working. So finding a new way to do things and really making this pivotal shift in your head about how you think about yourself and your life and your money is something that I learned how to do in sobriety through rehab and have also applied to my debt payoff. The next thing I learned in rehab is sometimes you have to hit rock bottom before you're ready to make a change. There were many points in my struggle with drugs and addiction that I had bad things happen, but it was never enough to like jolt me to be like, okay, you need to really seriously make a change, or this is going to have like very extreme consequences and maybe permanent consequences in your life. So for me, when I hit rock bottom, I went to rehab at that point. And that's the point that I gave into the process, realizing that this way that I was living my life wasn't working, and I needed to figure out a new system and learn other tools besides what I already had to get sober. Now, a comment about rock bottom. Rock bottom looks different for everyone. And for me, when I was newly out of rehab, I went to a meeting and people were telling these horrific stories, and I was just thinking to myself, like, I don't feel like maybe my situation was that bad because other people have it a lot worse. And so I shared that in the meeting. I was like, everybody seems like way worse. Like, do I even belong here? And I'll never forget this either. This guy turned to me, he's probably like 50 or something, and he was like, at one point I was where you are right now, and if you keep going down the path that you were on, you will be where I am today. Like, you can get that much worse, and I wasn't as bad as I am now at one point in life. And like, that really stuck with me. And so the thing is, like, rock bottom looks different for everyone, and just because somebody has it worse or somebody's not as bad as you, like, don't compare anybody else's life to yours, because your life is your own and you're unique in your situation. So when you feel like you are so fed up, you don't want to do this anymore, you can't live like this anymore, like, that's your rock bottom. And whatever that looks like, how bad or not bad it is at that point, like, don't judge it, just acknowledge that that's what's happening and dedicate to making a change. So for me, rock bottom with my debt was when my daughter was born, and my husband and I were both working full time, and I went back after maternity leave, and I looked at our finances and I was like, look, with daycare costs and all of our other debt, we are going to be in the negative every single month, and like, this needs to change, otherwise we're gonna go bankrupt eventually. Like, we can't sustain this way indefinitely. And for me, like, having another person to be financially responsible for was enough of a jolt for me to like wake up and figure out that we need to get our debt under control. I think a lot of people, especially women, when you get pregnant or have a baby, that's a point in your life where you get sober or you make a big change in your life, like financially, because your life is different now. Your brain changes when you have a baby, and that's great, and that's what happened. I got sober before I even started trying to get pregnant, but I, you know, started focusing on debt payoff after my daughter was born. So for sobriety, that wasn't impacted by, you know, me getting pregnant, but debt payoff it was. But the thing is, like, that's great and all, and I'm glad that I had that motivation to make a change, but that doesn't have to be the reason why. In fact, it's even better if it wasn't, because that's like a lot of pressure on your kid that, like, okay, me caring about you enough was what made me want to change, not me wanting to change for myself. So if you're someone who doesn't have kids or isn't planning to have kids, like, you don't need to have a kid in order to wake up to the situation you're in and make a change for the better. Like, in fact, I think it's almost better if you don't do it that way, because you're not relying on your kid as the reason, you're doing it for yourself, and doing something for yourself, I think, is the best reason to do it. Okay, the third thing I learned in rehab that also helps me pay off debt is sometimes you're gonna need to change who you spend your time with. When you are in active addiction, you're spending your time probably with other addicts, and if you want to stay sober, you're gonna have to change your friend group and your surroundings and the situations you put yourself in order to stay safe and stay sober. It's really hard to stay sober if you're around a bunch of people who are not sober. So that's something that's really hard to accept, I think, for a lot of people. And the same thing applies to debt payoff. It really does. Like, if you are in a friend group that doesn't respect the fact that you are trying to be smart with your money and trying to be careful and have debt you're trying to pay off and make responsible decisions, and those friendships rely on the fact that you spend money together and spend, you know, not just a little bit that's in your budget, but these go on these extravagant vacations or go out to eat all the time, and that's just not something that you are able to do anymore, then you may have to change the people you hang out with. Now, hopefully, instead of having to change who you hang out with for debt payoff, you can set healthy boundaries with those friends. And if your friends are true friends, then they'll just go get an ice cream cone with you and sit on your couch or sit on your back deck and, like, hang out. They don't need to do something extravagant with you in order to sustain that friendship, because there's more to it than spending money together. But if you have friends that are not supportive of your goals and hopes and dreams financially, then those people are really not true friends, and you either need to set boundaries with them and have limited friendships with those people, or you need to change friend groups entirely, which is a really hard thing to accept, because you're kind of becoming a different person through this process, whether it's getting sober or paying off debt and getting your finances in order. Both of those things, you're becoming a different version of you, a better version of you, and so you may not fit into the same friend groups that you did before. All right, the fourth thing that I learned in rehab that also applies to debt payoff is you are going to have to examine your identity and how it is tied to how you spend money. For example, when I was doing drugs all the time, that's where most of my money was going, was towards drugs. And that was because, not just because drugs are expensive, but also because in my mind, like, the way I viewed myself was somebody who did drugs. And so in order to fund that idea of myself, I had to dedicate my money to spending on drugs. And a lot of what I got happiness from was from others perceiving me as somebody who does drugs. And there's a whole lot of layers to that. It's not that I wanted to be seen as a drug addict necessarily. I wanted to be seen as somebody who was tough, as somebody who wasn't afraid of anything. That was a big piece of it, as somebody who was willing to take risks and somebody who was independent. And, you know, there was a lot of things tied up with the reasons why I did drugs, and that's not what this video is about. But I had to take a hard look when I was getting sober at, like, how my drug addiction was tied to my identity of myself. And once I stopped doing drugs, I had this kind of identity crisis of, like, who am I? If I'm not this person that parties, like, who am I? And the same goes for debt payoff. You're gonna have to take a hard look at how money is connected to who you are and who you want to be perceived as. So if you have fancy bags and you have nice clothes and you go on extravagant vacations so other people perceive you as this person who has money, and you start paying off debt and you have to cut back on all of those things so you don't have those things to rely on for your happiness and for your identity, you're gonna have to dig deep and really explore, like, who are you and who do you want to be separate from money? Like, who do you want to be if you can't rely on the things money could buy to build your identity, if you have to build it from within rather than externally? And that, I think is a lifelong struggle for everyone. That's something that doesn't happen overnight, and I think you evolve through the decades, your identity of yourself as you age too. And I remember when I was in rehab, I was 26 years old, and this girl, you were in like little apartments that had 2 bedrooms and there was 2 beds in each room. And this girl got put in our apartment and she had just turned 18, and we were just sitting on the back deck like smoking cigarettes and talking. And we were talking about how old we were. And I told her I was 26, and she looked at me and she was like, oh, so it's pretty much over for you then. And I remember thinking like over for me, like, and I felt really insecure in that moment because I was like newly sober and figuring out who I was and thinking like, am I this like old person now? Like 26, am I old? And now it's silly because like being 34 now, I think, oh, I wish I was 26 again. That's so young. And that young woman had some major issues. I won't even get into it. I think I'm telling that story because it connects back to like the way other people perceive you. I think can have a big impact on how you feel about yourself. And so if you are using money as a tool to get people to perceive you a certain way, then when you have to remove that because you're working towards goals of sobriety or financial security or debt payoff, then you have to rethink the way you think about yourself and find happiness in a new way that's really a healthier way. All right, tip number 5 that I learned in rehab that helps me pay off debt is the earliest days are where you're at highest risk of relapse, and as time goes on, it does get easier. So when it comes to sobriety, obviously, like the first days of sobriety are really tenuous because you're just figuring out how to stay sober. You're oftentimes like really sick and really weakened because of everything you put your body through, and your brain isn't even functioning properly. I think it took like a good 6 months to a year for my brain to not be foggy anymore after I got sober. And so like the early days of sobriety are hard because you're learning these new skills and you're applying these new skills that you've learned, and it's scary and it's unknown and it's different. And like I just talked about, you're figuring out who you are. And then as you get more used to being sober and you readjust your identity about who you are around being a sober person, then it becomes easier over time. Also for me, like the cravings day 1 out of rehab, I remember the first day of detox, I was like really wanting to leave, and the counselor was trying to convince me to stay, and he brought me into his office and he sat me down and he was like, look it, I have X number of years sober, and if there was a pile of drugs on my desk right here right now, I wouldn't touch them. I wouldn't do them. And I remember thinking to myself, that's impossible. Like that's impossible for me to ever do. If there was a pile of drugs right there, it would be impossible for me not to do them. And I just remember thinking, how will I ever get to that place? And now 8 years later, like I can say with confidence the same thing. Like if there were drugs, I wouldn't touch them. In fact, when we moved a few years ago, I found something that I had forgotten that I had hidden, and I immediately flushed it down the toilet. It didn't even cross my mind to even consider taking it because it was just like, I'm so far beyond that. It just wasn't worth it to me. So it just goes to show, like day 1 in detox, I was nowhere near being able to like comprehend not doing drugs. And then now 8 years later, it's easy for me. It's something I don't need accountability in the way I did early on. And the same thing goes for debt payoff. When you are early on in your debt payoff journey and you're used to swiping your credit card and you're used to impulse spending and you're used to not budgeting and you're used to living in a way where your finances are in chaos and you're used to that chaos, it's easy to fall back into it because it's comfortable and you know it. And when you are learning these new skills and figuring out a new way to run your life and your finances, at the beginning, like you're not in the routine of it. It's not comfortable and normal to you. It's normal to be in financial chaos. And so that's the most critical time. The first, I would say like probably month, but even the first 6 months of getting your finances in order and getting your debt paid down, I think are the most critical, because as time goes on, you will develop new habits, new routines with your finances and with your debt payoff that make it easy. And like, I would say it's still emotionally hard at this point because I get tired and I get overwhelmed with debt payoff, but when I make those payments, it doesn't even cross my mind to use that money for anything else but debt payoff. It's just automatic, like no matter what, that money is going to debt. It was designated in my budget. I always keep up with my budget. It's going to debt payoff. I make the debt payment and it just gets done every month with consistency because I'm more practiced at it, and we've been paying off debt for almost 2 years now. And so it's so much easier than at the beginning to make those debt payments because it's something that I've gotten used to. All right, and the last tip that I learned in rehab that I use for debt payoff is that we didn't get addicted in one day, so easy does it. And that means that it didn't take one day to become addicted to drugs or become addicted to alcohol or whatever the thing is you're addicted to, or it didn't take one day to get into a bad financial position. Likely, I mean, I guess it's possible that happened, but I think it's probably unlikely that that happened to anyone. It's probably a series of decisions over time or a series of events over time that caused a bad financial situation or an addiction to develop. So if it took you a while to get to a bad place, it's probably gonna take you a while, maybe not as long, but a while to get back to a good place or get to a good place for the first time if you've never been in a good place with your money or your finances or whatever it is you're working on. So go easy on yourself because it's not gonna happen overnight. As much as we want the healing and the improvements and everything to happen overnight, it's not going to happen. And it's really important that you take your time to learn the skills and really hone them, because these changes that you're making in your life, they're not a crash diet. They're not something that you're just gonna do really quickly, really aggressively, and then everything's gonna be fixed. This is a lifestyle change. This is who you are going forward indefinitely. And so it doesn't happen overnight, so you gotta take your time and be patient and be consistent and keep pushing, and you will make improvements in your life. So that is it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys have any other tips of things, you know, any people who have gone through rehab or gone through like an NA or NA type program, if you have any tips of things you learned in those programs that you find helpful in personal finance or debt payoff, then comment below. If you like this video, make sure you give it a big thumbs up. It really helps on my channel. And if you want to see more videos like this from me, then make sure you hit that red subscribe button down there. I'd love to have you as a subscriber, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye.